The sirens cut through the quiet night as the police car pulled up to our house. On the pavement, right outside my front door, one man lay clutching his broken arm, his face twisted in agony. Two others were sprawled nearby, bloodied and groaning, barely able to move. And there, standing in the doorway, was my wife, Madison. She was pale, trembling, her eyes wide with terror. She looked like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. I stood there beside her, calm, collected, staring directly into the eyes of the officers. They exchanged glances, and one of them cautiously asked me, "Did you call us, sir? Are you the one who stopped the assault?" I almost laughed at the irony. Those men lying on the ground weren't attackers. They were Madison's friends. I had known about her secret life for some time, biding my time, waiting for the right moment. And here it was, handed to me, right on my doorstep. With a smirk I barely hid, I looked at the officer and said quietly, "Yes, I stopped them. But not because I feared for myself. They're part of her filthy secrets. And I had a response for them." Madison's face twisted in shock and fear, realizing in that instant that her web of lies had finally unraveled. All her excuses, her business trips and friends, they were all laid bare now, in the worst way possible. I could see her struggling to find words, but she was cornered, trapped by her own betrayals. One of the officers turned to her, asking if she had anything to say. But she just stood there, frozen, her eyes locked on me, knowing this time there would be no escape. The officers led the men to the ambulance, while Madison and I were left standing in silence. The air between us was thick, filled with unspoken words and long-buried secrets. Madison still hadn't spoken. She looked at me, her eyes shifting between anger and fear, as if trying to decide whether to fight or flee. I broke the silence first. "How long, Madison?" I asked, my voice low but cutting. She hesitated, her lips pressed into a thin line, before she scoffed, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Oh, don't play the victim here, Mark," she snapped, crossing her arms. "Maybe if you hadn't been so distant, this wouldn't have happened." I felt my jaw tighten. It was unbelievable. She was still trying to twist it, to make it seem like I was somehow responsible for her lies. I couldn't believe the audacity. Madison had been sneaking around behind my back, lying to my face, and now, here she was, looking at me as if I was the one who had done something wrong. "Distant?" I replied, my voice dripping with disbelief. "So, I didn't sit around, worshipping you every second of the day, and that's your excuse for running around with these clowns?" She rolled her eyes, her expression turning defiant. "You wouldn't understand," she muttered. "You were always more focused on your job, your routines, everything but us." I felt a bitter laugh escape my lips. Unbelievable. Here was the woman I thought I knew, the woman I had given everything to, trying to paint herself as the victim. And the worst part? She looked like she believed her own lies. "So that's it?" I asked, stepping closer. "You let these men into our life because I didn't give you enough attention? That's your big excuse?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked away, biting her lip, maybe realizing that her justifications sounded as hollow as they were. The silence was so tense I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I waited, giving her one last chance to say something, anything, that might explain this insanity. But she just stood there, silent, defiant, as if she was daring me to keep pressing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she sighed and shrugged, her expression almost bored. "Look, Mark," she said, her voice cold, dismissive, "what did you expect? Life with you got stale. I needed excitement." There it was. Blunt, cruel, like a slap to the face. She didn't care about the damage, didn't care that she had shattered everything we built together. In that moment, I realized Madison wasn't just unfaithful, she was heartless. The woman I thought I knew was nothing more than a stranger who didn't care if she tore me apart. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to let her see how deeply her words cut. But inside, I felt the anger burning, a fire I could barely contain. "Fine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "If excitement is what you wanted, Madison, then you found it. But this? This is the end. We're done." Her face faltered for a second, as if she hadn't expected me to make such a final statement. But then, as quickly as the surprise came, it disappeared. She tilted her head, giving me a mocking smile. "Suit yourself," she said, and with that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the darkness, staring after her, realizing that everything I thought we had was nothing but an illusion. Madison's cold indifference stung like salt in an open wound. Watching her walk away, so casual and dismissive, I felt something snap inside me. It wasn't just anger anymore, it was a clarity, a cold, ruthless understanding that this marriage, this facade we'd been living, was truly over. But I wasn't about to let her walk away as if she could just brush this all under the rug. Not without consequences. The next day, I began putting my plan into motion. I reached out to a lawyer first thing in the morning. I wasn't just interested in a divorce, I wanted to make sure Madison didn't come out of this unscathed. I spent years working hard, saving, building a life that I thought was for both of us. And now, after her betrayal, there was no way I'd let her walk away with a single thing more than she deserved. When Madison came home that evening, she barely acknowledged me. She poured herself a glass of wine, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened, as if last night's chaos hadn't shattered everything between us. She looked so calm, so completely unfazed, that it almost made me question my own sanity. Was this the same woman I'd loved, trusted, shared my life with? How could she be so unaffected? But I wasn't about to let her silence control the narrative. I'd had enough of her deceit and arrogance. I walked up to her, my voice steady but cold. "I've filed for divorce," I said, watching her carefully, hoping for a flicker of reaction. She paused, her fingers hovering over her phone screen, but then she just shrugged. "Well, I guess that makes things easier for both of us, doesn't it?" she replied with a smirk. That smirk, it was like she enjoyed watching me fall apart, like this was all some twisted game to her. But I kept my composure. I had no intention of letting her know how deeply her betrayal had cut. "You think this is some kind of joke, Madison?" I asked, my voice edged with disbelief. "You think you can just walk away from everything we built together, like it meant nothing?" She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Oh, please, Mark. Don't act like this is some great tragedy. You and I both know the spark died years ago. You were too busy with your routines, your principles, to notice anything else. Don't make this about me." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was twisting the knife deeper, blaming me for her own mistakes. For a moment, I wanted to shout, to scream, to make her understand just how much she'd destroyed. But I realized then that she would never understand, or even care. I leaned in, my voice barely a whisper. "One day, you'll regret this, Madison. One day, you'll look back and realize what you threw away." She rolled her eyes, taking another sip of her wine with that infuriating smirk still plastered on her face. "Mark, I'm already moving on. Maybe you should try it, too." That was it. She had no remorse, no guilt, not even an ounce of shame for what she'd done. I turned and walked away, feeling a strange sense of finality. This woman was gone, whatever version of her I'd loved was dead. And now, I was left with the empty shell of someone I no longer recognized. But as I left the room, I made a silent vow. Madison might think she'd won, that she could walk away without consequences. But I wasn't done. Not yet. There were still ways to make sure she felt every bit of the pain she'd inflicted, and I was going to make sure she remembered this betrayal for the rest of her life. The days that followed were a whirlwind. I threw myself into planning, channeling every ounce of betrayal, anger, and bitterness into a calculated strategy. Madison wanted to act like she could just shrug me off and walk away as if nothing happened, as if I was a mere inconvenience in her pursuit of excitement. But she underestimated me. One of the first steps was securing every financial asset I could. Our joint accounts, investments, and properties, things Madison hadn't even considered because she was too busy living in her fantasy world. She wasn't prepared for how swiftly I could move. I met with my lawyer, detailing every betrayal, every lie, and the mockery she'd made of our marriage. This wasn't going to be a simple divorce, it was going to be a battle, and I was going to make sure she felt every ounce of what she'd put me through. The next step was more personal. I knew Madison had built her social life around lies. She had crafted a carefully curated image, one that painted her as the perfect wife and professional. Her reputation was everything to her, and if there was one thing I'd learned about Madison, it was that she'd rather lose money than lose face. I started by subtly leaking hints to her friends, just enough to plant seeds of doubt. A word here, a mention there, it was incredible how fast the rumors began to spread. People started to whisper, asking questions, connecting the dots. Madison's carefully crafted image was beginning to crack, and I could see the effect it was having on her. She came home one evening, slamming the door behind her, looking furious. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the frustration in her eyes. For the first time in weeks, I saw her mask slip, and I knew she was feeling the consequences. "What the hell are you doing, Mark?" she spat, her voice laced with barely contained rage. I raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Doing? I don't know what you mean, Madison. I'm just living my life. Moving on, like you suggested." She glared at me, her jaw clenched, realizing she'd walked right into the trap. Her friends had started distancing themselves, her colleagues were giving her suspicious glances, and suddenly, her world wasn't as secure as she'd thought. "You're trying to ruin me," she hissed, her eyes flashing with anger. I held her gaze, calm and unflinching. "Ruin you? No, Madison, you did that all by yourself. I'm just making sure everyone sees who you really are." For the first time, I saw genuine fear flicker in her eyes. She was realizing that this wasn't going to be a clean break. She couldn't just walk away from the wreckage she'd caused. Her smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of fury and desperation. "You think this will make you feel better?" she sneered, trying to regain control. "You think dragging me down will fix anything?" I shrugged, keeping my tone even. "Maybe not. But it's a start. You see, Madison, you thought you could betray me and just move on without a second thought. But actions have consequences, and you're about to learn exactly what that means." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, but I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. There was still a part of me that remembered the woman I once loved, the person I had built a life with. But that person was gone, replaced by this cold, manipulative stranger. And if she wanted to play games, I was more than ready. As the days passed, Madison's perfect world continued to fracture, piece by piece. The whispers among her friends turned into open conversations. Invitations she once took for granted were suddenly withdrawn, and the sympathetic glances she received at work shifted into stares of disdain. Madison was losing her control over the narrative, and it was driving her insane. I could see it in her eyes every time she came home, the frustration and confusion. Her confidence had been replaced by anxiety, her arrogance by bitterness. It was almost poetic justice, watching her unravel in the same way she'd torn our life apart. She wanted excitement, well, now she was getting it, but not in the way she'd hoped. One evening, she confronted me again. This time, her tone wasn't cold or mocking, it was desperate, laced with a fury that barely concealed the fear simmering underneath. "Mark, what are you telling people?" she demanded, her voice sharp, but wavering. "You're spreading lies about me, ruining my reputation for no reason." I almost laughed at the hypocrisy of her words. "No reason? Madison, everything I've said is the truth. If you're finding it hard to live with, maybe you should have thought about that before betraying me," I replied, my voice calm, steady. She clenched her fists, taking a deep breath as if she was trying to steady herself. For a second, she looked like she might break, like she might finally admit some sort of regret. But then, just as quickly, her face hardened, her eyes narrowing in defiance. "You're pathetic," she spat. "This is all you can do? Hide behind rumors and lies because you're too weak to move on?" Her words were meant to sting, but they only solidified my resolve. She still didn't get it. She still thought she could walk all over me and come out unscathed. "Weak?" I repeated, my voice low. "You don't understand strength, Madison. Strength is watching the person you loved turn into a stranger and still finding the courage to do what's right. You chose this path, not me." She looked away, biting her lip, clearly shaken but refusing to show it. I could see the cracks in her armor, the way her eyes darted around the room, searching for a response, a way to regain control. But there was nothing she could say to undo the damage, nothing that could erase the betrayal. I decided to press further, letting her feel the weight of every word. "Did you really think I'd let you destroy everything we built together and walk away like it was nothing? You threw away our marriage, our future, for what? A thrill? Some cheap sense of freedom?" Her face twisted in anger, her defenses finally crumbling. "You were the one who made life unbearable," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You were cold, distant, always wrapped up in your own world. I needed more than that. I needed something real, something exciting." I took a step closer, my voice barely a whisper. "So, this is your idea of real? Lies? Deception? Destroying the one person who trusted you?" She fell silent, her gaze dropping to the floor. For a moment, she seemed to deflate, the last shreds of her defiance slipping away. I could almost see the weight of her actions settling on her shoulders, the reality of what she'd done finally hitting her. But just as quickly, she straightened, her face hardening again, as if refusing to show any vulnerability. "I don't need to justify myself to you," she muttered, her tone cold but shaky. I nodded, accepting her words for what they were, an admission of defeat. Madison was too proud to admit fault, too stubborn to accept the consequences of her actions. But she couldn't hide from them anymore. The life she'd tried to escape into was falling apart, and all she could do was watch as everything she'd built crumbled before her. As she walked away, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was a sense of justice, a feeling that, finally, she was facing the reality of her choices. And as much as it hurt to watch the woman I once loved turn into this hollow shell, I knew it was the only way she'd ever understand the weight of what she'd done. Madison's life was unraveling faster than even I had anticipated. She was visibly shaken, haunted by the whispers and the isolation. Her polished, untouchable facade was cracked, and everyone could see the real person beneath. The person I had slowly come to realize was more selfish and deceitful than I'd ever imagined. One night, I returned home late, half expecting her to be gone or at least avoiding me. But to my surprise, she was there, sitting alone in the dark living room, clutching a glass of wine with a dazed look in her eyes. She looked up as I entered, and for a moment, there was a flicker of vulnerability, a look I hadn't seen in her in years. "Mark," she began, her voice softer than I'd heard in months. "Is this really what you want? To tear each other apart like this?" The question took me off guard. I was prepared for another argument, another snarky remark, but not this. There was something about her tone, the hollow look in her eyes, that hinted she was nearing her breaking point. A part of me almost wanted to reach out, to find some piece of the Madison I once loved. But I reminded myself of all the lies, all the hurt she had caused, and steeled my heart. "What I want, Madison, is to get back the years you took from me," I replied, my tone harsh but honest. "But we both know that's impossible now." She looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. I could tell she was wrestling with something she wasn't sure she could say. After a moment, she looked back up, a slight tremor in her voice. I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand," she murmured. "It just happened." One lie led to another, and before I knew it, I was too deep to come back. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to take her words as a sign of remorse. But the truth was, it sounded like an excuse, another attempt to dodge accountability. "It just happened. Madison, you made choices. You lied to me, to everyone around you, because it was convenient. You wanted to live two lives without facing the consequences, and now that they're here, you want sympathy." Her face twisted in anger, but this time, I saw something else: hurt. She took a long sip of her wine, then finally put the glass down, her hands shaking slightly. "You think I'm some kind of monster, don't you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You think I didn't care at all?" I didn't answer. I just looked at her, my silence speaking louder than words. Suddenly, she broke down, her composure shattering in front of me. I'd never seen Madison like this, never seen her walls come crashing down. She buried her face in her hands, and for the first time since the affair began, I saw genuine tears. Part of me wondered if this was real or just another tactic, but the sight of her like this hit me harder than I wanted to admit. "I know I messed up," she said through her tears. "I know I've lost everything. But I just wanted something different, something that made me feel alive again. I didn't mean to destroy us, Mark." There it was, the root of it all. Her words hung in the air, a bitter confession of the emptiness she'd felt. And while I hated what she'd done, a part of me understood. We'd both fallen into routines, both lost ourselves somewhere along the way. But she'd chosen to handle it in the worst possible way. "Madison," I said, my voice softer, though I could feel the anger still simmering beneath the surface, "if you were unhappy, if you felt lost, you could have talked to me. We could have faced it together. Instead, you chose to burn it all down." She looked up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes searching mine for some sign of forgiveness. But I couldn't give it to her. Not yet. The wounds were too fresh, the betrayal too deep. "So, what now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. Part of me wanted to let her go, to cut ties and leave this all behind. But another part, the part that still held on to the hope of who we once were, needed closure, needed to know that this nightmare would have an end. "Now," I said, looking her straight in the eye. "Now, we figure out what's left, if there's anything worth saving." She nodded slowly, a glimmer of hope mixed with despair in her gaze. For the first time, we were both facing the reality of what lay between us: shattered trust, broken dreams, and a path forward that neither of us could yet see. The following days were a strange dance of forced civility and unspoken resentment. Madison and I moved around each other in the house, careful not to set off any more explosions, but the tension was suffocating. For the first time, she seemed genuinely shaken, even remorseful, yet the damage was so severe that neither of us knew if there was any point in trying to salvage what was left. One evening, as we sat across from each other in the dimly lit dining room, Madison finally broke the silence. "Do you remember the trip to Colorado we took a few years ago?" she asked, her voice soft, almost nostalgic. I did remember. It had been one of the rare times we had both unplugged from our daily lives. Just the two of us, surrounded by mountains, laughing, talking, reconnecting in a way that felt real. But now, that memory felt tainted, as if it belonged to a different life, a different version of us. "I remember," I replied, not sure where she was going with this. She looked down, twisting her fingers nervously, a gesture I hadn't seen in years. Madison had always been so composed, so confident. But now, she seemed vulnerable, exposed in a way that felt almost foreign. "I keep thinking about that trip," she murmured. "About how simple it felt, how connected we were. Somewhere along the line, we lost that, didn't we?" I couldn't argue with her. We had lost something, a connection that had once been our foundation. But what she'd done was more than just drifting apart. It was betrayal on a level that went beyond simple neglect. "Yes, we lost something," I replied, my voice steady but edged with the bitterness I couldn't shake. "But you didn't just let go of us, Madison. You burned it down. You chose to lie, to hurt, to destroy everything we built. You could have told me you were unhappy. We could have worked on it. But you chose the easy way out, didn't you?" Her face crumpled slightly, and I could see the weight of her actions pressing down on her. For a brief moment, I thought she might argue, defend herself again, but she just nodded, accepting my words in silence. "You're right," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was a coward. I wanted something, anything to make me feel alive again, but I went about it in the worst possible way. I thought you'd never understand. That you wouldn't care." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had loved her, given her everything I could. I wasn't perfect, I had my flaws, my routines that maybe kept me a bit too distant. But I had never stopped caring. To hear her say that she thought I wouldn't care, it was like discovering a fresh wound, a hidden layer of betrayal that I hadn't prepared for. "So, you thought I wouldn't care," I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping me. "You thought I was too busy with my own life to notice that you were slipping away?" "Madison, I was there. I was right there, trying to hold things together, trying to keep us from falling apart. But you were already gone, weren't you?" She looked away, guilt etched into her face. "I don't know when it happened," she admitted, her voice thick with regret. "But yes, somewhere along the way, I just let go." We sat in silence, the weight of her words settling between us. For the first time, I realized that what we had lost wasn't just because of her affair. We had both let it happen in our own ways, both drifted apart without noticing until it was too late. But only one of us had chosen to betray, to step over the line. "So what now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Can we even fix this?" I thought about it, about everything that had happened, and everything that could never be undone. The anger, the bitterness, the shattered trust, they were still there, lingering like shadows. But beneath it all, there was a small part of me that still remembered what we had once been. A part that wanted to believe redemption was possible. "I don't know," I said honestly, meeting her gaze. "Forgiveness, trust, they don't come back overnight. And some things, maybe they never come back." She nodded slowly, her face pale, but there was a hint of acceptance in her eyes, a recognition of the weight of what she had done. "If there's even a chance," she said quietly, "I want to try. I know I don't deserve it, but I don't want this to be the end of us, Mark. Not like this." I felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger, sadness, a faint spark of hope. I wanted to believe her, to believe that people could change, that wounds could heal. But the scars she'd left ran deep, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to see her without remembering the betrayal. "If we're going to try," I said slowly, "it won't be easy. You're going to have to face what you did, every single day. And so will I. This isn't something that just goes away." She nodded, her expression serious, almost resigned. "I'm ready to face it, if it means there's still a chance," she whispered. And with that, we both sat in the silence of what lay ahead, knowing that nothing would ever be the same, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was a small sliver of hope left to salvage something from the wreckage. In the days that followed, Madison and I navigated a fragile truce. We both knew that rebuilding, if it was even possible, would require facing the ugly truth every day. The tension was still there, lingering in every room, in every shared glance. But there was also a sliver of willingness, a mutual understanding that we'd either confront the damage head-on or finally walk away for good. We decided to see a counselor together. Sitting side by side in that small, sterile room, the distance between us felt almost insurmountable. I couldn't look at her without remembering the betrayal, without feeling the anger simmering just below the surface. But the counselor forced us to peel back the layers of our hurt, our resentment, and our mistakes. Madison was forced to confront her choices, and I was forced to confront my own role in the breakdown of our marriage. One day, during a particularly intense session, Madison broke down. I'd never seen her so vulnerable, so raw, and the honesty in her words hit me harder than I expected. I thought I'd lost myself, she admitted, her voice trembling. I looked for something outside of us because I was too afraid to look inside. I was scared of admitting that I felt empty. And instead of turning to you, the person who'd been by my side all those years, I ran. I took the coward's way out. Her words hung in the air, raw and honest in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time, I felt a small shift in my own heart, a tiny crack in the armor I'd built to protect myself from the pain. I wasn't ready to forgive her, not yet, but I could see that she was genuinely confronting her own darkness. It was a start. Over the following weeks, the anger began to ease, replaced by a cautious curiosity. We spent time talking about things we hadn't discussed in years. We went back to the beginning, to the parts of ourselves we'd lost along the way. Slowly, I began to see glimpses of the woman I had fallen in love with, the woman I thought was gone forever. But this time, she was stripped bare, honest in a way that was both painful and healing. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Madison reached for my hand. Her touch was hesitant, tentative, and I felt a surge of emotions, anger, resentment, but also a strange, fragile warmth. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I looked out at the fading light, the sky tinged with the last colors of the day. The path ahead was uncertain, and I didn't know if we'd ever fully recover from the wounds she'd inflicted. But at that moment, holding her hand in the quiet of the evening, I felt a small sense of peace. "This isn't forgiveness, Madison," I finally said, my voice steady. "But it's a start." She nodded, understanding, and for the first time in what felt like forever, we shared a moment of silence that wasn't filled with tension. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, and there were no guarantees. But maybe, just maybe, we'd found a small sliver of hope. In the end, I didn't know where the road would lead. The scars of her betrayal would always be there, etched into the fabric of our relationship. But I knew that I could either carry the weight of resentment for the rest of my life or try to let go, step by painful step. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But for the first time, I saw a path forward, one that might lead to something resembling peace. As we sat there, watching the world grow dark, I made a quiet promise to myself: I'd give us a chance to rebuild, to create something new, scarred but resilient. And if we failed, at least I would know that I had tried.